Today we'll be discussing different models of communicative competence. The first model that we will be discussing is Canales-Swan's model of communicative competence. The initial Canales and Swan's model of communicative competence was first introduced and developed in 1980. It was inspired by Haim's model of communicative competence. And following his work, they proposed their communicative competence model consisted of grammatical competence, sociolinguistic competence, and strategic competence. Canales later revisited and revised this framework in 1993 and divided socio-linguistic competence of their model into further two components. One is socio-linguistic competence and the other is discourse competence. So initially we did not have the discourse competence. The initial model only consisted of grammatical competence and socio-linguistic competence and strategic competence. But later on they revised this framework and divided socio-linguistic into two components. Social-linguistic competence, where they introduced and discussed the appropriateness of register. Register, we all know, is a variety of language which is used for specific purpose in a specific situation, and a more formal language. For example, instead of using dad, such as father, a word father is used. So it's more, it takes into account the formal use of language. Politeness, norms, or the way or style in which the language is spoken. And discourse competence involves cohesion and coherence. Now, in the second model, you can see they have the grammatical competence, which is this. Knowledge of language, which is all the linguistic units. Syntax, structure of sentence. Lexis, which is all set of words and phrases. Then they have socio-linguistic competence, which is basically concerned with learners' ability to use language correctly in a specific social context. Now, here you see, moving on to two more components. One is socio-cultural rules. These are socio-cultural rules, which means rules of using language in a particular social situation concerned with style, politeness, and register. Then we have discourse rules, which is knowledge of combining language structures to produce unified text in different modes, writing and speaking. And here you have cohesion in form and coherence in meaning. Cohesion in form means the idea is to present logical sequence of thought, and there should be connectivity. So cohesion has to do with the form that are used to develop coherence. Then you have strategic competence, which basically refers to compensation for lack of knowledge in other three competences, where the expression or the input breaks down due to some lack of linguistic information or some other lacking in any of these three competences. So if there is any shortfall, then strategic competence comes in and helps and facilitate in terms of the fulfillment of language function or language expression. Celsi-Murcia, Donny Thurl, they proposed their own model of communicative competence in 1995, which is basically an elaboration of the previous model. So we saw that in the Canales and Swan's model, it is the socio-linguistic component which was emphasized and which was further divided into two components. But in their model, in Celsi-Murcia model, we see discourse. Thus is the component in which or through which all the other competencies must be studied and ultimately assessed. So the focus of this is the discourse competence, that it should be the one and all other competencies should be viewed and assessed in the light of discourse. If one is concerned with communicative competence, which is not a hierarchical system of discrete competences, there is no hierarchy in terms of grammatical competence, followed by social linguistic competence, followed by discourse competence. There is no such hierarchy. In fact, all these competencies should be seen as integrated or as an interactive set of competencies or abilities, but a dynamic interactive construct. So we see that this is the first model introduced by Canale and Swen in 1980, and then they revised it in 1983, where socio-linguistics or socio-culture has been divided into socio-culture competence and discourse. Now, based on these two models, Selse et al. Proposed their model, and in their own words, let's try to understand what changes they have introduced in their model. They say we have decided to use term linguistic competence instead of grammatical competence in order to indicate unambiguously that this component also includes lexis and phonology in addition to morphology and syntax. So basically, when we looked at grammatical competence, it seems as if it is only concerned with morphology and syntax, but linguistics covers lexis, phonology, morphology, and syntax. They say, second, we use the term socio-cultural competence instead of socio-linguistic competence to better distinguish it from actional competence. So they introduce actional competence in order to distinguish it from socio-linguistics. They used socio-culture because socio-culture deals with not only the linguistic aspect as well as the norms and values and rules based on culture. And actional competence, since it refers to performatives or actions that takes place in a particular situation, that is why it was important that these two areas should have been presented distinctively. Then they move on to say that since the social-linguistic dimension of communicative competence has traditionally included contextualized language function, and also to highlight the fact that language resources are in the linguistic, actional, and discourse. So all the language information is in the linguistic, actional, and discourse component, while the socio-cultural knowledge is necessary for appropriate deployment in the other components. So socio-cultural is in the strategic competence, because strategic is one where you see the facilitation of language function if other competencies break down. So to conclude, Canale and Swen's initial model in 1980 of communicative competence consisted of three components: grammatical, social-linguistics, and strategic competence, which was later on revised in 1983 with the division of social-linguistics into social-linguistic and the discourse components. Selse et al. Proposed their model based on Canale-Swen's model with addition of actional competence and minor changes in labeling.